how's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on the first day of 2024. Great way to start the new secular year. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Paul is in the house, Jonathan in Thousand Oaks, Guy in Ohio, Bill in mid-Missouri, Leon in Illinois, Joe in the Inland Empire, Karen in Northern California, Chaim in Florida, Ellis at Shalom, Marjorie in Virginia, and Spencer in Connecticut. Also, Chandra in Appleton. Welcome, everybody. Nina's away. She and our daughter are taking a little mother-daughter trip. So she's away until Thursday. I'm on my own. And that means that I can't moderate the discussion, and usually Nina passes me the questions through our Google Doc. So at the end of class, I'll scan the comments to the best of my ability. But just bear with me if I make a mistake. I'm on my own here. Tonight's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Gabriella Karen, our very dear friend. She lives across the street from us, and she is a Holocaust survivor with an extraordinary story to tell, and she travels around the world telling it. It's really been such a privilege to get to know her. We have her over for Shabbos dinner very often, and Gabriella, we're so grateful just to have you in our lives, and thank you also for sponsoring tonight's episode of AT Daily in honor of David Lenga. So, Gabriella, may you and everyone you love be showered in blessings. May you keep telling your story. It's an amazing story. She and her whole family were hidden by a very righteous Gentile. Imagine a young man, I think he was in his late 20s, a young attorney who had a one-bedroom apartment across the street from Gestapo headquarters in Bratislava, I think it was the city, in Slovakia. At any rate, this young man hid a family of 8 for almost a year in his one-bedroom apartment. Amazing the risk he took. They all survived. The family had to be so quiet the whole day, every day, not use the bathroom, not flush a toilet, since they were hiding in this young man's apartment. The whole story is amazing. But at any rate, Gabriella, please, may you be blessed to keep telling your story to 120. May people learn the lessons from your story. Please, God, may we all learn those lessons. We say amen. All right. Let's get to, and thank you, Gabriella, for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Okay, our daf tonight is page 60, daf Samech, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 6, today concluding our discussion of Mishna number 3, and then we'll get into Mishna number 4. We've got some beautiful Agadata tonight, very inspiring, interesting stories. Not only are we going to be learning law, but we're also going to be hearing some very interesting stories from the Talmud. Okay, so we picked this up near the top of page 60a, concluding our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 6. And the Mishnah teaches that if the wind fanned the flames, all the people involved are exempt, right? So we're talking about damages caused by fire. Yesterday we were talking about, if somebody hands fire, let's say to a miner, and then what happens if you hand him a torch and he starts a fire, or if you hand him a glowing coal and he fans it into a flame. different outcome, of course, than if you hand it to a competent adult, etc. So we're talking about causation and who really started the fire, right? So the Mishnah teaches that if the wind fanned the flames, then all the people involved, meaning the one who brought the wood, the one who brought the match, and the one who fanned the initial fire, I mean, they were all involved in building a fire. They didn't necessarily do anything negligent. The wind came along and fanned the flame and it took off. Maybe it was a typical wind, maybe it was an atypical wind, but if it was really the wind that caused, this, let's say, a proper controlled fire to take off and then other property was damaged, well, the ones who created the fire, they didn't do anything wrong. They weren't negligent. It was this unexpected wind that made it take off, and so they would be exempt, indicating that even if one fanned the fire at the same time that the wind was blowing, he is exempt. And the Gemara cites a baraisa in which the sages taught the same idea explicitly. In a case where one fanned the flame, and at the same time the wind fanned the flame, so if his fanning has sufficient strength by itself to fan the flames, then he is liable for damage caused by the fire, since even without the wind, the fire would have spread. But if his fanning alone was not sufficient, he is exempt, right? In other words, his fanning would have just, made a little fire that he could cook on. It was the wind that came and made a much larger fire that went and caused damage. So the Gemara asks, why is he exempt if his fanning is not sufficient? Let it be the same law as the case of one who winnows grain on Shabbos by throwing it in the air, and the wind assists him by separating the chaff from the grain. So in such a case, he is liable for desecrating Shabbos, despite the fact that without the assistance of the wind, he would not have been able to winnow the grain. Abaye said, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where he fanned the fire from one side, and the wind fanned it from the other side. And the fire was blown in the direction that the wind was blowing. Therefore, it is clear that his fanning did not help the fire spread, so he is exempt. And Rava says, we are dealing with a case where he fanned it along with a typical wind. And this was not sufficient to cause the fire to spread. And suddenly, an atypical wind came and fanned it. Therefore, he is exempt, since he could not have anticipated this. And Rabbi Zera said, we are dealing with a case where he only heated the fire by breathing on it, rather than fanning it properly. And Rav Ashi said, when we say that one is liable in a case where he winnows and the wind assists him, meaning liable for desecrating Shabbos, this statement applies with regard to the laws of Shabbos only. Because with regard to Shabbos, the principle is that the Torah prohibited planned, constructive labor. And the primary consideration is that his objective is accomplished, even if he did not perform the entire act of labor by himself. But here, in the context of damages, he is considered to have caused damage merely through indirect action, and the one who causes damage through indirect action is exempt. And you can see that we might be tempted to borrow legal principles from one area of the law to another because it sounds similar, but when you do a closer inspection, it's not really relevant because it's not applicable. Right, so the idea is that if he's fanning this flame and then the wind comes along and blows some hot cinders and then causes a fire to start somewhere else, we're going to say that, well, he might have contributed a little in the fanning that he did, but what he did would not have caused a fire to spread onto the neighbor's property and destroy all kinds of things and make him liable for damages. He didn't do that. The wind did that. Now, when you say that somebody on Shabbos would not have been able to separate the chaff from the grain but for the help of the wind, okay. But this guy is out there, doing the labor of, tossing the grain up in the air so that the wind can blow through it and blow the chaff out of it. He might have not been able to make that separation in the absence of the wind. But what the heck is this guy doing out there performing the prohibited labor of separating, right? Separating one thing from another is prohibited on Shabbos because that is a constructive labor. separating the chaff from the grain is definitely prohibited on Shabbos. So the fact that he couldn't have done it without the assistance of the wind, would certainly not keep him from being liable for violating Shabbos, because what's this guy doing out there on the hill tossing the grain up and down? He's making use of the wind. He couldn't have done it without the wind, but he's certainly performing a prohibited labor. So it's a very different body of law, whether somebody transgressed Shabbos or whether somebody becomes liable to pay damages for actually causing a fire to spread. Very different articulation of the principle. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 6. Here comes Mishnah number 4. If one sends forth a fire, i.e., allows it to escape, and it consumes wood or stones or earth, he is liable. As it is stated, if a fire breaks out and catches in thorns so that a stack of grain or standing grain or the field is consumed, the one who kindled the fire shall pay compensation. And that verse is Exodus 22, verse 5, which teaches that he is liable also for destroying the field itself, right? Not just the grain that's standing in the field, but the field itself. Now, when you first hear that, what I just read, that verse, right? The beginning of the Mishnah. If one sends forth a fire, meaning he allows it to escape, from his cooking area, let's say, and it consumes wood or stones. Okay, I understand that his fire got away from him and consumed wood. What do you mean stones? How could a fire consume stones? Well, here's a very interesting note from Rav Steinsaltz. Maybe anyone in the building trades would have already guessed this, but I didn't know. Limestone makes up approximately 10% of all sedimentary rock and is used extensively for building. And when limestone is heated, a chemical reaction occurs, turning the calcium carbonate in the stone into calcium oxide. And as a result, the rock becomes soft and flaky. And when subsequently exposed to rain, it can crumble. So indeed, right, fire can damage stone if the stone is limestone. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Here comes the Gemara. So with regard to the verse cited in the Mishnah, again, the verse is from Exodus 22:5. If a fire breaks out and it catches in thorns, so that a stack of grain or standing grain or the field is consumed, the one who kindled the fire shall pay compensation. Now, can you guess what's the first thing that the sages are going to say? Why do we need all these examples in the verse in the Torah? It shouldn't have been enough to say that if somebody makes a fire and if the fire breaks out, right, and the property of others is damaged, he is liable. Why does the Torah give all these examples? So, with regard to the verse cited in the Mishnah, Rava says, why do I need the merciful one to write in the Torah all of these terms? Thorns, a stack of grain, standing grain, and field, which seem to be redundant. Rava explains, all the terms are necessary, because if the merciful one had written only thorns in the Torah, I would say it is specifically thorns for which the merciful one renders one liable, because it is common for fire to be near them, to be near thorns, and it is common that one is negligent. In other words, where are you going to make a fire? If you're going to make a fire in the field somewhere because you're going to have a barbecue or because you're burning leaves, right? Or you're making some kind of a little bonfire, where are you going to make that fire? Are you going to do it next to somebody's stacked produce? Obviously not, because the stacked produce, meaning the harvested produce, which is now a pile of produce, that's very valuable. You wouldn't make a fire anywhere near that, because if your fire got away from you, you'd be liable for a tremendous amount of damage. So where would you make your fire? In a waste area, right? So the waste area is where the thorns are. So what he's saying is, well, the Torah doesn't need to tell us not to make a fire near valuable things. People get that. They have common sense. But the Torah might have to teach us that even if you make a fire, near somebody's waste area, the part of their field where they let the thorns grow, and you damage his thorns, you're still going to be liable, even though you might have said, well, what do you care about your thorns? And his answer is, well, it's not your business what part of my property I care about or don't care about. You burnt my thorns. You owe me money. All right, so Rava says all the terms are necessary because if the merciful one had written only thorns in the Torah, it would say it is specifically thorns for which the merciful one renders one liable because it is common for fire to be near them, and it is common that one is negligent because he thinks it doesn't matter. But with regard to a stack of grain, with regard to which it is not common for fire to be near it, as grain is valuable, so one keeps it out of harm's way, and it is not common that one is negligent in allowing it to catch fire. So I would say that he should not be liable. And if the merciful one had written only a stack of grain, I would say that it is specifically for such a stack that the merciful one renders him liable because it involves a substantial financial loss for the owner of the stack of grain. But with regard to thorns, which involve only a minimal loss, I would say perhaps he should not be liable. Therefore, the verse teaches us that he is liable for damage to thorns as well. Right? So both thorns and the stack of grain. The least valuable thing in the field and the most valuable thing in the field. Now, why do I need the Torah to state the term standing grain? It is in order to teach that just as standing grain is exposed, so too one is liable only for damage caused by fire for all items that are exposed. Now, this is fascinating. Right? Since we already had as examples the stacked grain and the thorns, so therefore the most valuable thing, the grain that's already been harvested and piled there, or the least valuable thing, the thorns, you might think, well, and that would cover everything in between. So why does the merciful one state in his Torah the standing grain, right? Meaning the ripe grain that has not yet been harvested? One idea would be, well, maybe you might think that it wouldn't be liable since it's still alive and attached to the ground. But why would you think that? If somebody else's fire damages my grain right before I harvest it, that's a huge loss to me. Maybe, if it's even worse, if the fire burns my stacked grain, because I already went through the labor of harvesting it before it was burned, but still, the standing grain is extremely valuable. So the sages actually learn out something different. What they're going to say is the standing grain is something that is exposed, something that is revealed. There's the grain standing in the field. And this is as opposed to something that is concealed, right? So in other words, and that's very interesting, right? If I'm hiding, I don't know. Let's say I have a sports car. I don't really want my neighbors to know I have this sports car. Maybe they might steal it. Maybe they might vandalize it. Maybe they might be jealous of me, whatever. So I hide this low-riding fancy sports car in my field of corn, right? No one can see it. It's hidden in the cornfield. And then somebody's fire gets away from them and burns my cornfield. Now, what are they liable for? They realize they messed up, they did something wrong, and they burnt my cornfield. So they're definitely going to be liable for that, as we have the example of standing grain, in this case, standing corn. But my car that I hid in the cornfield, why should they be liable for that? No one would have any idea that I was hiding a sports car in my cornfield. And according to the sages, this liability for damage caused by fire extends only to what is revealed. And that's what this Torah teaches when it says standing grain, as opposed to what is concealed. And so if I concealed my sports car in my cornfield, and then somebody's fire spreads and burns down my cornfield, they're not going to have to pay me for my sports car, which is an interesting ruling. So let's see how that works, right? This is to teach. The Torah is teaching that just as standing grain is exposed, visible to all, so too one is liable only for damage caused by fire for all items that are exposed, and one is exempt from liability for damage to items that are concealed. So the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who deems one liable for a concealed article damaged by a fire, right? Rabbi Yehuda would say, no, my neighbor who burnt down my cornfield also has to pay for my sports car if it was concealed in my sports car, in my cornfield. But that's the minority opinion. The law is not according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, if we're going to say if the law were according to Rabbi Yehuda, then why do I need the Torah to state the term standing grain? And the Gemara answers, the term serves to include all items that have stature, i.e. trees and animals, not only produce. And the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of the rabbis who derive the law of concealed articles from the term standing grain, from where do they derive that all items that have stature are included? And the Gemara answers, they derive it from the term or standing grain, right? Since the additional word or is an inclusive term in this context. And the Gemara asks, and what does Rabbi Yehuda derive from the additional word or? And the Gemara answers, he requires the word or to divide the terms, i.e. to teach that one is liable for damage to any one of the items listed. Right? Stacked grain, standing grain, field, thorns, etc. It's not that all of them have to be damaged before the one who is liable has to pay damages. If any one of them is damaged, he is liable for damages. And we learn that out from using the word or. And so the Gemara then asks, and from where do the rabbis derive the law to divide the term so that one is liable for damage to each one independently? And the Gemara answers, the rabbis derive it from the second instance of the word or, as the verse states, or the field, right? It said, or the or standing grain, or the field, right? So they derive it from the second use of the word or. And the Gemara asks, well, what does Rabbi Yehuda derive from the phrase or the field? And the Gemara answers, well, since the merciful one wrote in the Torah or standing grain, he also wrote or the field for stylistic consistency. So Rabbi Yehuda does not derive any additional halacha, any additional law from the second use of the conjunction or. Now, Rava continues to elaborate on the different terms in the verse. And why do I need the word field in the verse? It serves to include liability for damage in a case when the flames licked a plowed field and charred its stones, right? So damage to the actual field. Not just the grain that is still growing in the field, not just the grain that is stacked there after it was harvested, not just the thorns that may be growing there, meaning any other, foliage that isn't actually what you're harvesting and growing on the farm, but even damage to the field itself. So it serves to include liability for damage in a case where the flames licked a plowed field and charred its stones. So the Gemara asks, but let the merciful one write only the term field, and then it would not require all these other terms. If once damage is done to a field and anything in it, why do we need to specify standing grain, stacked grain, thorns, and the word field when the word field would seemingly include all of that? If one is liable to damage for a field which is not totally destroyed by fire, he is certainly liable for damage to other items that are completely destroyed. So the Gemara answers, it is necessary to write the other terms as well, because if the merciful one had written only field, I would say that for what is in the field, yes, one is liable. But for anything else, no, one is not liable. Therefore, it teaches us that one is liable for any damage caused by fire. Right? If your fire gets out of control and causes damage to people, you're going to have to pay. Now, the Gemara cites an Agadic midrash based on this verse. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, right, so now that we've brought in this verse about fire breaking out and catching thorns, standing grain, stacked grain, etc., we're going to take a little digression and we're going to learn a kind of a spiritual, ethical teaching from this same verse. And this is fascinating. So, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that Rabbi Yonason says, calamity befalls the world only when wicked people are in the world. But The calamity begins only with the righteous first. As it is stated in the verse, if a fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that a stack of grain or standing grain or the field is consumed. So how are we learning this? When does the fire, which in this case represents the calamity, when does the fire emerge? At a time when the thorns, which represent the wicked, are found with it. But the calamity begins only from the righteous first, as it is stated in the continuation of the verse, and a stack of grain is consumed. Right? It is not stated if a fire breaks out and catches in thorns and consumes the stack of grain. Rather, it states a stack of grain is consumed, meaning that the stack of grain, which represents the righteous, has already been consumed before the thorns. So the concept is, why do terrible things happen in the world? Because the wicked are doing their wicked business in the world. But who gets hurt first, even before the wicked get hurt? The righteous. The righteous. So what do we learn from that? First of all, we don't live in a world where as soon as wicked people behave wickedly, lightning comes out of the sky and strikes them down. And as soon as righteous people behave righteously, a pot of gold falls out of the sky, or they have perfect health. Right? Obviously, God's presence is hidden in this world, and that's why we often see, sadly, that the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. But here, what Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani is saying is, if you see a calamity happening in the world, terrible things are happening, okay, the reason it's happening is because the wicked are doing their wicked business. And God is not going to, make a quid pro quo that would reveal God's presence so obviously. But God is angered by all that wicked behavior, and he unleashes the calamity into the world. And the calamity strikes the righteous first. Seems a little unfair, but that's the way the world works. What is he actually telling us? What he's saying to us is that if we would view ourselves, we should view ourselves as average, right? We should always view ourselves as average, somewhere in the middle. Hopefully we're not utterly wicked people, please God. But we should never view ourselves as righteous either. We're somewhere in the middle. But let's say that we can identify people who are also somewhere in the middle, but who are clearly behaving wickedly. So they're bringing wickedness into the world. We shouldn't think to ourselves, well, it's too bad they're doing that, but what can I do about it? Hopefully it won't affect me. It will affect me. It will affect you. So when we see wickedness in the world, we don't sit back. We have to do something about it. That's what Shmuel Bar Nachmani is telling us. Because the more wickedness is allowed to prosper in the world, or to flourish, let's say, eventually calamity will come. And once the calamity is unleashed, it won't be limited to the wicked people. So we got to try to sort of up the game of everybody by, doing what we can to curb wicked behavior and inspire people to righteous behavior and get involved, right? That's what he's saying. Now, Rav Yosef taught a baraisa. What is the meaning of that which is written with regard to the plague of the firstborn, right? So the 10 plagues, which was the culmination of the enslavement in Egypt. Then Moses comes at God's bequest and says to Pharaoh, let my people go, right? The 10th plague was the plague of the firstborn. After that, Pharaoh said, go, you Jews, get out. We've had enough. We understand. We enslaved you. We were wicked. Go. But what about this plague of the firstborn? What is the meaning of that which is written with regard to the plague of the firstborn at Exodus 12:22? And none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. What does this mean? If the plague was not decreed upon the Jewish people, right? We had the sign to the angel of death marking on the doorposts of all the Jewish homes. so that he would, move on to the Egyptians. But if the plague was not decreed upon the Jewish people, why were they not permitted to leave their homes? Answer: once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. And not only that, but it begins with the righteous first, as it is stated in the verse, and will cut off from you the righteous and the wicked. Ezekiel 21:8, where mention of the righteous precedes the wicked. Same teaching as what Shmuel Bar Nachmani was saying, right? Once the wickedness in the world reaches a certain level, a calamity will be unleashed. And once it's unleashed, it's going to hurt the righteous just as much as the wicked, and maybe even more so. So we got to try to prevent that. Rav Yosef cried, and he said, are all these righteous people also compared to nothing when calamity strikes? And Abaye said to him, it is goodness for the righteous that they die first. As it is written, the righteous is taken away because of the evil to come, Isaiah 57:1, so that he will not have to endure the suffering that will befall the people. You could argue it's always better to be alive, but if something really terrible is coming, maybe better to perish quickly than to perish slowly and agonizingly. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, now we're on page 60b, a person should always enter an unfamiliar city at a time of good. We've seen this teaching before, meaning while it is light. When you arrive in a new city, you should try to arrange your travel plans so that you arrive in the daytime. As the Torah uses the expression, it is good, with regard to the creation of light. See Genesis 1:4. So this goodness is manifest in the sense of security one feels when it is light. And likewise, when one leaves a city, he should leave it at a time of good, meaning after sunrise the next morning. As it is stated in the verse, and none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. Sadly, when you go to Israel, you arrive in the day, usually, which is great. But when you leave, like all the flights seem to leave at 1 o'clock in the morning. So tough to leave Israel in the daytime. But of course, we live in a society that has much more lighting at night than they did in the days of the Talmud. The sages taught, if there is plague in the city, gather your feet. What does that mean? Gather your feet. That means limit the time that you spend outdoors. As it is stated in the verse, and none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. Right? The verse about the 10th plague. And it says in another verse, come, my people, enter into your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little moment until the anger has passed by. That's Isaiah 26:20. And it says, outside the sword will bereave, and in the chambers terror. Deuteronomy 32:25. I believe Deuteronomy 32:25 is probably referring to the curses that will befall the Jewish people if they don't, as a nation, cling to Torah. Right at the end of his life, Moses is telling the people, you're going to enter the promised land now. All of you teach your children. All of you keep living a Torah life. And you will be blessed in every which way, and you'll be so prosperous and happy, and you'll thrive in the land. But if you abandon Torah, if you chase after the gods of others, you will be cursed in so many different ways. And among, the curses was this something like this: outside the sword will bereave, and in the chambers terror. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for citing the additional verses introduced with the term, and it says? The first verse seems sufficient to teach the principle that one should not emerge from one's house when there is a plague outside in the city. So the Gemara answers, and if you would say that this matter, the first verse that states that none of you shall go out until the morning, applies only at night, but in the day one may think that the principle does not apply. For this reason, the Gemara adds, come in here, come, my people, enter into your chambers and shut your doors behind you. When there's a plague in the city, whether it's night or day, stay indoors. And if you would say that this matter applies only when there is no fear outside, which explains why it is preferable to remain indoors. But when there is no fear inside. If you would say that this matter applies only when there is no fear inside, meaning there's a plague out there in the city somewhere, but you have no reason to be afraid in your house, so certainly you're going to stay indoors. But where there is fear inside, where there's also something to be afraid of inside your house, then one might think that when he goes out and sits among people in general company, it is better than being, I guess when the plague has struck inside your house. Maybe then you want to run out of your house. Therefore, the Gemara introduces the third verse and says, come in here, outside the sword will bereave, and in the chambers terror. And this means that although there is terror in the chambers, outside the sword will bereave, so it is safer to remain indoors. When it talks about the sword that will bereave, this is not understood to mean like soldiers are out marauding in the city. We're talking about a plague. So whose sword is out there, bereaving people? It's the angel of death. So, the concept so far is if there's a plague in your city, lay low, stay indoors. Now, before I go any further, what's interesting is, despite what we've said so far, says Rav Steinsaltz, quoting the Shulchan Aruch, what is the actual halacha? One must be careful to avoid any dangerous situation. Therefore, the sages said that one should flee from a city where there is a plague. One should flee as soon as the plague begins, before it takes hold in the city. So only if you're unable to leave the city where there's a plague raging, sure, then lay low, stay indoors, and don't go out in the city. But if you have an opportunity to get the heck out of that city... Now, at a time when there is a plague, Rava would close the windows of his house, as it is written, for death has come up into our windows, Jeremiah 9:20. And the sages taught, if there is a famine in the city, spread your feet. That means leave the city. As it is stated in the verse, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram, right, before his name was changed to Abraham, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, Genesis 12:10. And it says, if we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come, let us fall into the host of the Arameans. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. That's 2 Kings 7:4. Now, what is the reason for citing the second verse introduced with the term? And it says, and if you would say that this matter, the principle of leaving the city, applies only when there is no uncertainty concerning a life-threatening situation, but where there is uncertainty concerning a life-threatening situation, this principle does not apply. Well then, come in here, come and let us fall into the host of the Arameans. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. And the sages taught, if there is a plague in the city, a person should not walk in the middle of the road, due to the fact that the angel of death walks in the middle of the road, as since in heaven they have given him permission to kill within the city, right? A plague has broken out, so the angel of death is active. So then he goes openly in the middle of the road. By contrast, if there is peace and quiet in the city, do not walk on the sides of the road, as since the angel of death does not have permission to kill within the city, he hides himself and walks on the side of the road. Interesting. The sages taught, if there is a plague in the city, a person should not enter the synagogue alone, as the angel of death leaves his utensils there. And for this reason, it is a dangerous place. And this matter, the danger in the synagogue, applies only when there are no children learning in the synagogue, and there are not 10 men praying in it. But if there are children learning in the synagogue, or there are 10 men, a minyan, praying there, then it is not a dangerous place. The sages taught, if the dogs in a certain place are crying for no reason, it is a sign that they feel the angel of death has come to the city. And if the dogs are playing, it is a sign that they feel that Elijah the prophet has come to the city. And these matters apply only if there is no female dog among them. If there is a female dog nearby, then their crying or their playing is likely due to her presence. So interesting, right? If inexplicably you hear a lot of dogs barking, time to leave. Inexplicably, you hear a lot of dogs playing happily. Ooh, something good is about to happen. Rav Ami and Rav Asi sat before Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha. One sage said to Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha, let the master say words of halacha, of Jewish law. And the other sage said to Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha, let the master say words of Agadah, right? These more ethical, spiritual teachings. Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha began to say words of Agadah, but one sage did not let him, so he began to say words of halacha. But then the other sage did not let him. So he was frustrated. One guy wants him to teach halacha and won't let him talk Agadah. The other one wants him to teach Agadah and won't let him talk halacha. So he said to them, I will relate a parable. To what can this be compared? It can be compared to a man who has two wives, one young and one old. So the young wife pulls out his white hairs so that her husband will appear younger. And the old wife pulls out his black hair so that he will appear older. And it turns out that he ends up bald because between the two wives, they pull out all his hair. And Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha continued and said to them, so if so, I will tell you a matter that is appropriate to both of you, which contains both halacha and agadah. In the verse that states, if a fire breaks out and catches in thorns, where we started, Exodus 22:5. So the term breaks out indicates that it breaks out by itself. Yet the continuation of the verse states, the one who kindled the fire shall pay compensation, which indicates that he must pay only if the fire spread due to his negligence. So the verse can be explained allegorically. The Holy One, blessed be He, said that although the fire broke out in the temple, in the Holy Temple, when it was destroyed, the first temple or the second temple, that the fire broke out in the temple due to the sins of the Jewish people, it is incumbent upon me, upon God, to pay restitution for the fire that I kindled. Is that interesting? That God would say, they're sort of putting words in God's mouth, that, well, God acted righteously, and the Jews brought, through their sadly, wandering away from Torah, failing to fulfill their obligations, chasing after the gods of others, and ultimately, just as Moses promised them in the name of God, they would lose the privilege of living in the land, in ancient Israel. So God did as He promised, right? He brought that fire, that calamity onto the Jewish people because of their sins. And yet, nevertheless, God owes them because He brought that fire in. I suppose what He means by that is that God will also fulfill God's promise to eventually send Mashiach and bring the people back and make amends for that early destruction by bringing the third temple, which will be grander and more magnificent than anything we could imagine. But He continues like this. I, God, kindled a fire in Zion, as it is stated. The Lord has accomplished His fury. He has poured out His fierce anger, and He has kindled a fire in Zion, which has devoured its foundations. Lamentations 4:11. And I will build it with fire in the future, as it is stated. For I, says the Lord, will be for her a wall of fire round about, and I will be the glory in her midst. Zechariah 2:9, right? Prophesying for the future. There is a law, a halakha, that can be learned from the verse in Exodus, as the verse begins with damage caused through one's property if a fire breaks out, and concludes with damage caused by one's body, the one who kindled the fire. And this indicates that when damage is caused by fire, it is considered as though the person who kindled the fire caused the damage directly with his body. And that serves to say to you that the liability for his fire damage is due to its similarity to his arrows. Just as one who shoots an arrow and causes damage is liable because the damage was caused directly through his action, right? If I shoot an arrow at you, I didn't touch you, right? My hand never touched you. I didn't come close to you. I didn't punch you in the face. Hey, it was the arrow that hit you. I fired the arrow. So that's considered direct damage, as if I punched you in the face. And what he's saying is fire that you start and ends up hurting a person is considered to be your direct damage. You caused him direct damage, just as if you shot him with an arrow, which is equivalent to punching him in the face. Now, the Gemara continues with another statement of Agadah on a related topic. The verse states, "And David longed and said, 'Oh, that one would give me water to drink of the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate.' And the three mighty men broke through the host of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate. And they took it and brought it to David. But he would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord." That's 2 Samuel 23, 15, 16. So it's a very perplexing passage, right? This is David is in the midst of his war with the Philistines. He says, "I'm longing for water, and not just any water, but I want water from Bethlehem, from this well that is by the gate." And so three of his mighty soldiers risked their lives to get him that water. They brought it to him, and he wouldn't drink it. He poured it out. So what's going on? The sages understood that David was not simply asking for water, but he was using the term as a metaphor referring to Torah, right? Water in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, anytime the word water comes up, the sages will look carefully and say, is this a metaphor? Because very often water represents Torah, something that flows from God into our world and sustains us, right? We need Torah the way we need water. So he was using the term as a metaphor referring to Torah, and what David was actually doing was raising a halachic dilemma. He had a question that he didn't know what the answer was, and he needed an answer. That's what he was saying. So what is the dilemma that David is raising? And Rav says that Rav Nachman says he was asking about the law with regard to a concealed article damaged by fire, right? Back to the sports car in the cornfield. So King David wanted to know whether, I don't know if he's king yet, he probably isn't king yet, but he wanted to know whether the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that one is liable to pay for such damage. Now, obviously, Rabbi Yehuda lived much, much later than King David, but the legal questions already existed at that time. And so David wants to know, if I set a fire and I destroy something, and it turns out that there's something else hidden within the thing I destroy, am I going to be liable for destroying the hidden thing as well as the exposed thing? So he wanted to know whether the halakha is in accordance with this opinion, like Rabbi Yehuda would hold centuries later, who holds that one is liable to pay for such damage, or whether the law is in accordance with the rabbis who would disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and exempt one from liability for damage by fire to concealed articles. And the sages in Bethlehem answered David what they answered him. That's what he meant when he wanted water from Bethlehem, that he wanted the sages of Bethlehem to answer his question. So Rav Huna stated a different explanation of the verse. There were stacks of barley belonging to Jews in which the Philistines were hiding. And David wanted to burn down the stacks to kill the Philistines and save his own life. And he raised a dilemma. What is the law? Is it permitted to save myself by destroying the property of another? Now, for sure, if somebody points a gun to your head and says, you go murder Reuven, or I'm gonna murder you, you are not permitted to murder Reuven. To save your own life, you cannot take somebody else's life. But to save your own life, can you take Reuven's property? How can you compare someone's property to somebody else's life? Sounds like it should be permitted, but David wasn't sure. David was very righteous. He was careful. So this is the question. This was his dilemma. So they sent the following answer to him. It is prohibited to save oneself by destroying the property of another. Is that a general blanket prohibition? Or are we saying it's prohibited to save yourself by destroying the property of another, where if you destroy it, they're going to end up starving to death, right? That's a different question. But they said to him, it is generally prohibited to save oneself by destroying the property of another, but you are king. So this is after he was already the king. But you are king. And a king may breach the fence of an individual in order to form a path for himself, and none may protest his action, i.e. the normal laws of damage do not apply to you because you're the king. It's good to be the king, as Mel Brooks says. Now, the rabbis, and some say that it was Rabbah bar Mari, gave an alternative explanation of the dilemma and said the stacks of barley belonged to Jews and there were stacks of lentils belonging to the Philistines. So David needed barley to feed his animals. And David raised the following dilemma. What is the law? I know that I may take the lentils belonging to the Philistines to feed my animals, but is it permitted to take a stack of barley belonging to a Jew to place before one's animal for it to consume, with the intent to pay the owner of the barley with the stacks of lentils that I'm going to be seizing from, our opponents in the war, the Philistines? So the sages of Bethlehem sent the following reply. If the wicked restore the pledge, give back that which he had taken by robbery, walk in the statutes of life, committing no iniquity, he shall surely live, he shall not die. That's a verse from Ezekiel 33:15. Now, this verse teaches that even though the robber repays the value of the stolen item, he is nevertheless considered to be wicked and is described as such in the verse, and a commoner would not be allowed to act as you asked. But you are the king, and a king may breach the fence of an individual in order to form a path for himself, and none may protest his action. So the Gemara discusses the different explanations. Now, granted, according to the one who says that David was asking whether he could take the stacks of barley and exchange them, i.e. repay the owners of the barley with the stacks of lentils, this is as it is written in one verse. And the Philistines were gathered together into a troop where there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the people fled from the Philistines. 2 Samuel 23:11. And it is written in one other verse, he was with David at Pas Damim. And there the Philistines were gathered together to battle, where was a plot of ground full of barley. And the people fled from the Philistines. And this apparent contradiction can be reconciled by saying that there were two fields, one of barley and one of lentils. But according to Rav Huna, the one who says that David's question was asked because he wanted to burn the stacks of barley, for what purpose does he require these two verses? How does he explain this contradiction? And Rav Huna could have said to you that there were also stacks of lentils belonging to Jews, inside which the Philistines themselves were hiding. So granted, according to the one who says that David asked his question because he wanted to burn the stacks, this is as it is written in the following verse with regard to David. But he stood in the midst of the plot and saved it. And he slew the Philistines, and the Lord performed a great victory. 2 Samuel 23:12. But according to the one who says that David's question was asked with regard to exchanging the lentils for the barley, what is the meaning of the phrase, and saved it? And the rabbis answer that David saved it in that he did not permit them to exchange the value of the barley with the lentils. So granted, according to both of these two opinions, this is as it is written in two distinct verses, one describing the field of lentils and one describing the field of barley. Now we're on 61a. We're going to get a little start on this page. But according to Rava, who cited Rav Nachman, the one who says that David asked with regard to the law of concealed articles damaged by fire, for what purpose does he require the two verses that describe a field of lentils and a field of barley? And Rav Nachman could have said to you that David was asking both about concealed articles damaged by a fire and one of these other two dilemmas. So granted, according to the one who says one of these two explanations, that David was asking either about repaying barley with lentils or burning the stacks of barley, this is as it is written of David, but he would not drink it. David said to himself, since there is a prohibition involved in this action, it is not satisfactory to me to act in this manner. Even though technically it is permitted for a king, I would rather not do something that would be not permitted for anyone else. But according to the one who says that David was raising a dilemma with regard to the law of a concealed article damaged by a fire, since they sent him an answer that was a tradition with regard to the halacha, what is the meaning of he would not drink it? And the Gemara answers, this means that he did not say the law in their names. He did not transmit the ruling in the name of those who went in the time of battle to ask the sages what the law is. And David said to himself, this is the tradition that I received from the court of Samuel of Ramah, right, the prophet Samuel, with regard to anyone who hands himself over to die for the sake of words of Torah, The sages do not say a matter of halacha in his name, so that others will not follow this ruling and endanger their lives. Right? Very interesting. If somebody says to you, bow to an idol or I'm going to kill you, some would say you have to allow yourself to be murdered rather than commit idolatry. Some would say that it is permitted for you to allow yourself to be murdered rather than to commit idolatry. One is obligated or one is permitted, right? You're not going to commit idolatry. But in the view of the one who says it is permitted to accept that you should sacrifice your life, means you have an option, right? That you inside don't believe in the idolatry, but to save your life, you bow. I think the majority opinion is it's better that you should be murdered, that you should be martyred for this. But that's not what they're talking about. What they're saying is that somebody who didn't have to be martyred takes upon themselves to be martyred, that this is something that the sages say is not good, right? Like you shouldn't commit idolatry, but if you could just avoid the problem, you have to save your life. Life is always precious. Life is always better. You don't, pursue a martyr's death if you can avoid it. Like that's not what Judaism is, right? It's bad. It's bad to be a martyr. You only become a martyr if you are forced to by some, wicked enemy that forces this, like the Romans did to Rabbi Akiva and the other 9 martyrs. They didn't have a choice, right? But what they're saying here is don't put yourself in a situation where you'll become a martyr if you can avoid it. And how do we know that? Because, King David heard from the prophet Shmuel that we don't give over laws in the name of somebody who put himself in that situation. I'm very close to done. Questions or comments, get them in. And the Gemara answers another question. The verse states, he poured it out to the Lord. 2 Samuel 23:16, which indicates that David acted stringently and did not rely on the lenient ruling that he received. Now, granted, according to the one who says either of these two explanations, that David asked either about burning the stacks of barley or about replacing their value with lentils, he poured out the water to God due to the fact that he acted for the sake of heaven and did not rely on the lenient ruling that he had received, meaning as a king you can do this, anybody else would not be allowed to do that, so he didn't want to rely on that lenient ruling that he could do it because he's a king. He'd rather act at a higher level than that. But according to the one who says that David asked about a concealed article damaged by fire, then what is the reason that he poured out the water to the Lord? And the Gemara answers, the reason is that they said this law in the name of the tradition without associating it with any specific individual. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 6. And tomorrow, God willing, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll pick it up on page 61 with Mishnah number 5 in chapter 6. As I mentioned at the top of the class, Nina is on a mom and daughter trip with our daughter. I'm on my own here, so normally at this time she would have slipped me the questions, through our communication system, as it were. I'm just going to glance now and see if I can, scan and figure out which are questions for me and which are more like a discussion within the comments. Bill says, the angel of death sounds so considerate and conscientious, not leaving his tools around if he sees kids studying or a minion praying in the synagogue. And I think there's also this sense, the angel of death, right, is not on the level of demons, right? Demons are much, much lower creatures. The angel of death is, he's an angel, and he's sent into the world to perform a function. His mission is from God. But interesting, right, that he won't attack where people are praying or where children are learning Torah. I was just reminded of demons because, we see them elsewhere, not in these passages, but elsewhere in the Babylonian Talmud. There is this teaching, don't enter a ruin alone, because that's where demons hang out. And they attack people who are alone and isolated, right? So people who are isolated, who become isolated from society, who are, just venturing out alone, are much more vulnerable, to what demons can do. Demons, there's a lot of different definitions of what demons are. One idea, though, is that demons are these kinds of packets of evil that are created when humans transgress, right? When we transgress Torah law, there's like a residue of that transgression that is left in the world. And some would say that is the genesis of demons. That's just one of the theories, but don't enter a ruin alone. Jonathan, more on righteous and fire. I think this also points to the power of leadership. If righteous people lose their way and lead people in the wrong direction, then evil people will take advantage. And this also made me think of Rabbi Akiva, who followed Bar Kokhba. And maybe this is a warning about following false messiahs. There's a nice Kal Vachomer there, right? So for those not familiar, Bar Kokhba was a Jewish leader, warrior, quite mighty, quite compelling, quite charismatic, who led an insurrection and an uprising against the Roman Empire about 65 years after the destruction of the temple. The second temple was destroyed in the year 70. The Bar Kokhba rebellion was about the year 135. And it was a disastrous uprising. We were in no position or situation to rise up against the Romans. It succeeded for a short time. And then they sent many legions. And it was an absolute genocide. I think 1 million Jews were slaughtered when the Romans got through with that. And I think that's also when they salted the earth and really began, the exile from the Holy Land in earnest. I mean, some Jews always remained there. Jews have always lived in the Holy Land, some amount of Jews in Jerusalem and other areas. But as a thriving nation after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, it was really difficult. And that's why the seat of learning was primarily in the Babylonian Jewish community. The Jews that remained in the Holy Land had it really, really difficult after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. What Jonathan is pointing out is that Rabbi Akiva came to support this Bar Kokhba and even believe that he was Mashiach, was the Messiah sent. You can imagine that the first temple was destroyed 70 years later. We returned from the Babylonian exile and rebuilt the second temple. And so I think Rabbi Akiva was hopeful that, okay, so 65 years later, after the second temple was destroyed, maybe these were the seeds of Mashiach and a return, and that the third temple would be built then. And sadly, Rabbi Akiva was wrong, and 2,000 years later, we're still waiting. But the point is that if even the great and incredibly wise and saintly Rabbi Akiva could be so misled by Bar Kokhba, how much more so could we be misled, by some charismatic, apparent, candidate for Mashiach? To be very, very careful, right, about false messiahs or anyone, leading to a war that could have a disastrous outcome. Looks like you guys are having a conversation between you. Julie says, if God sets a fire, he is with us to purify our minds and hearts so the truth lives in and through us. God sometimes tests us to show our weakness, not to show our weakness, but to show our strength. Certainly. I completely agree with you there, Julie. When we talk about this problem that we alluded to earlier, that how is it possible that God, who is so kind and runs the world, allows so often the wicked to prosper and the righteous to suffer? It's a very difficult problem. We don't have an explanation at our fingertips. We have faith that when Mashiach comes, or when we leave this world and we're able to look back on history, then we'll understand it. But what has always given me comfort is that I'm a soul, you're a soul. We're all souls. We have bodies. We are souls. Our bodies are mortal and finite. Our souls are infinite and eternal. And the amount of time that we're here in these lives where we see all this apparent injustice, it's so brief compared to the life of the soul, that for all we know, the tougher the life is, the greater the lessons that are learned that we can take with us into the world of souls. And that gives me comfort. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, to continue with mission number 5 here in chapter 6. Have a great night.